here's John Campbell. He's got some more news about the vaccine you're not going to like. This is every day something more. They hid the data. They lied about everything. At every turn, they lied. They lied about masks. They lied about funding the virus. They lied about where the virus came from. And if you said it came from the lab, you were a white supremacist and a racist. Remember that?
That made sense.
Remember that? And they lied about herd immunity. They lied about natural immunity. They lied about transmission. They lied about contraction. They lied about their studies. They lied about everything to do with COVID. They lied about lockdowns. They lied about everything.
I mean, thank God the vaccine was so safe and effective. It's be a total wash.
Well, the vaccine is so safe and effective that Australia just released some new data, Kurt, and John Campbell's going to tell it to us. And if this doesn't piss you off, you're dead inside.
Welcome, a special welcome to Senator Gerard Rennick from Australia. Senator, welcome and thank you for coming on the programme.
Hi, John. It's great to be here and thanks for having me back on.
And I know it's the end of a busy working day for you, so we're very
Shut
grateful.
The fuck up and get to
The
it.
first question I have, Senator, is that I'm just looking at this excess deaths data from Australia here.
That?
And we see that the deaths in Australia started going up in May 2021, got higher in June, July, August, September, October, until in October there were 7,192 deaths. Now, this is in 2021. Now, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the Australia vaccine programme began in the February 2021. And
So they start the vaccine program in February 2021 in Western Australia. And then all of a sudden these people, they start having higher excess deaths.
Oh, probably climate change, right?
Well, let's see.
It didn't really kick off in Australia until 2022.
And so so the excess deaths cannot be attributed to COVID because COVID didn't really kick off in Australia until 2022, as he just shows you.
Two questions here, really. The first is I expect this excess deaths is front page news on all the newspapers and everyone's clamoring to work out why it is.
So he's being sarcastic. He's being a little cheeky. He's saying, no, I'm sure this is a front page news to everybody on every newspaper. No, it's not, because the news business is funded by Big Pharma. So they're burying this information, but we're bringing it to you here on YouTube.
And the second is, what do we think is causing this? What are the possible range of factors? So first of all, is this making the news? Are the mainstream media all over this story?
No, they're not. And they weren't over the story in 2021. And the reason why I think it's worth looking at 2021 rather than 2022 is because COVID was in the community in 2022, and it's been very easy to conflate the excess deaths with COVID.
So he's saying the reason why it's better to look at the 2021 data with excess deaths after the vax is because in 2022, there was COVID circulating in Australia. In 2021, there wasn't. So in 2022, people could say, well, that's excess death is from COVID.
Yeah.
Well, you can't say that about 2021.
Now, I do think that some of the excess deaths were due to COVID. However, I don't think that the majority of the excess deaths were due to COVID, and the reason why I say that is when I look at the 2021 data, the excess deaths did start to climb in May. Now, the vaccine program only really started to kick off in late March. So given that the ABS has a bit of a time delay in reporting, and for many people, they don't necessarily die in the first day.
So he's saying that the vaccine really kicked off in late March.
I was going to say, it's good you're saying that because I couldn't understand it.
So he's saying the vaccine program in Australia kicked off in late March.
Yeah.
And then there's always a lag in reporting adverse events. And then we found out then there's excess deaths started being reported in May.
After a vaccine injury, it may take a number of days or weeks. I think there's a very strong temporal association between the rollout of the COVID vaccine and the increase in deaths in Australia. And what's interesting is that by the end of 2021, we had about an extra 9,000 deaths. So deaths jumped from 162,000 to 171,000. Now, it's worth noting that in 2020, deaths were 2019 deaths were 164,000. So the lockdowns reduced the death rate by about 2,000 in 2020. And then it jumped about 9,000 in 2021. So we can't put the excess deaths down to the lockdowns and delayed doctor reactions and things like that. Maybe a part of the climb in excess deaths, but not all of it. And what's interesting is in that increase of 9,000, that happened from April, May onwards, that it started to spike, and it wasn't in the first 4 months. So if that was extrapolated for the whole year, that would work out at about 12,000 extra deaths, or almost a jump of 10% in that year, despite the fact there was next to no COVID in the community.
So they're saying in 2021, there was a 10% increase in excess deaths that started around April and May, right after the rollout of the vaccine in late March. And that it's 12,000 excess deaths, he's saying, for 2021. And it can't be from COVID because COVID wasn't circulating until 2022. I wonder what it's from.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we remember that there were small outbreaks in Victoria, but there was lockdowns and they were closed down. So there was essentially no COVID in 2021 in Australia.
That's right.
I've got the figure, Senator, in front of me here. It's 10,392 excess deaths in Australia in 2021. And bear in mind, this is a population of what, 26.5 million.
Yeah, about 25.5 million in 2021.
Yeah. Why is it that, I mean, imagine 10,000 people have been killed in a terrorist attack. This would be like massive news around the world. Why isn't this being reported in Australia?
Well, I mean, that's the $64 million question, John. And, I can only speculate as to the answer why, but I suspect it doesn't suit, the government or the media, or the health authorities, in the private sector, big pharma and things like that, to actually investigate further, because I can't see that there's any other reason other than the rollout of the COVID vaccines. Now, I'm not saying it's responsible for every excess death. I do think that, the lockdowns may have had some response to it. In 2021, there were about 1,300 deaths from COVID. In 2020, there were about 980. So COVID deaths did increase by about 300, but yet again, a long way short of the extra 10,000 in excess deaths. And what's also very interesting about these numbers is that the largest increase in the death rate was in Western Australia and Queensland, the two states where there were no lockdowns, and there was no COVID or very few cases of COVID. And if they were there, they were in people in quarantine. So yet again, the data would indicate that it was a result of the vaccine rollout rather than COVID itself.
It's still
I think all of Australia, but as you say, Queensland and Western Australia are
still a great vaccine.
I mean, still get it.
Super safe and effective, and everybody should be taking boosters.
You can't say it didn't slow the spread.
You can't say
they died.
because, as you say, there was no COVID in that time period. So the cause of deaths must be something other than COVID infection per se.
That's exactly right. And we've got two strong indicators there. One is obviously the temporal association between the rollout and the jump in excess deaths, and the geographic location of the excess deaths. And I should add a third one as well, was the large increase, and this is something you touched on in a recent video, in adverse events. And not just adverse events, but the rate of adverse events. So as you probably touched on in one of your recent programs last week, was that the death rate, the injury rate, from the vaccine rollout in Western Australia was 264 injuries per 100,000 doses versus.
So before COVID, the adverse event rate for vaccines overall in general was 264 adverse events per 100,000 vaccines. After the COVID rollout, what did that come up to?
It's a normal rollout, I think, of 11.1. So a jump of 24 or 2,400%, which was huge. And one thing you did, the death rate, the injury rate, from the vaccine rollout in Western Australia was 264 injuries per 100,000 doses versus a normal rollout, I think, of 11.1.
So after the vax, it was 264 per 100,000.
Okay.
Before, it was 11.1. So 11.1 per 100,000 adverse events were normal. And then after they rolled out the COVID vax, it went up to 260 something per 100,000. So from 11 to 260 some thousand adverse events. This is...
Boy, that really sounds like somebody did some math and said, this is acceptable.
And
it's still only 200 and something.
How is that possible? They didn't, and so they're going to talk about that.
A jump of 24 or 2,400%, which was huge. And one thing you didn't touch on, and I will touch on this now, is in page 11 in that vaccine injury report, 47% of those people who reported a vaccine injury actually went to emergency, or 48% I think it was, and another 9% were actually admitted to hospital overnight. So all up, 57% of people went to hospital as a result of their vaccine injury. Now, I'm pretty sure I can speak for a lot of Australians. We generally won't go to hospital for something that we consider mild, and we'll only go to hospital if we feel like it's an emergency.
Yep. So the report this is the report here that we're talking about. It's the official report from the Western Australian authorities, and it is a very detailed report. Now, of the adverse events reported following immunisation that took place in Western Australia, what percentage of those overall adverse events that occurred would you imagine actually got through into the report? Are people good at reporting in Australia? Because in the UK, it's actually quite a low percentage.
So they're saying, because we know that people don't report their adverse events from vaccines at a high rate. They say something like only 10% of actual adverse events get reported. So that's the question. And he's asking, what do you think the number is in Australia? How many people that actually got vaccine injured made a report?
Well, yet again, that's something that we don't know of. I suspect it's a very low percentage, but I can't be sure. I can only speculate. Now, I have a friend who's a cardiologist here in Queensland.
Listen,
he submitted 3 myocarditis reports to Queensland Health.
So he knows a cardiologist who submitted 3 adverse events reports about heart problems. And what happened to those reports?
And they sent them back to him saying the patients must go back to their GP and get the GP to lodge the myocarditis reports on behalf of the patient, not the cardiologist.
So the government agency sends those reports back to the cardiologist, says we don't want them. We're only going to accept vaccine adverse event reports from their primary physician.
Not from the heart guy.
Not from the heart guy.
From the not specializing in hearts
So why do you think they would have that policy? Because they're trying to discourage the reporting and they're trying to lower the numbers because they're all corrupt.
So that would indicate that the Queensland Health Department, at the very least, were doing their best to downplay or not report vaccine injuries. And I've had a number of anecdotal stories whereby people who had a vaccine injury, when they, when they either went to the hospital or saw their GP, that they were told verbally that their injury was caused by the vaccine, yet they would not write it down, nor the doctor at the GP clinic, nor the nurse or whoever it was at the registration desk would write down it's a vaccine injury. And in many cases, they wouldn't necessarily hand out the injury report from the hospital. The hospital wouldn't hand that over to the particular patient. So it would be underreported at the very least.
So the culture in healthcare in Australia really was not to report vaccine injuries, or it's almost like there was pressure not to report vaccine injuries. Am I going too far to say there was pressure not to report them?
No, I don't think you are with the COVID vaccines. I can't talk to other vaccines and the history of other vaccines. I suspect, like all things, other people have probably had vaccine injuries in the past and didn't report them. And I can't, I can't comment on that. But I've had, a large number of people that I've spoken to, and I've spoken to a lot of people over the last 18 months say that, their injury wasn't written down as a vaccine injury. I've also had a Queensland Health employee, come to me, and say that she was sacked, effectively because she was told by a doctor, to take off the fact that a 38-year-old pregnant woman, died a day after receiving the vaccine. And she was told, she was a administrator clerk, who kept the record of all the details, and she was told to remove the fact that she was vaccinated from her record. And she's had to move interstate. So there's some of the stories that I've been told throughout this period, which is just disgusting. And I've also been contacted.
Yes. I mean, we talk about these numbers, but when you get to the individuals at the end of the day like that, it really does have an impact.
Now, of course, I'm a comedian, so I'm still, every time I see a video like this, I'm gobsmacked at the number of comedians I see who aren't talking about this. They aren't saying a goddamn thing about any of it.
They don't know because they made it their business not to know.
They made it their business not to know.
They've said it's settled science.
Yes. And none of them are still taking their boosters. None of them are still taking their boosters, but they won't make a joke about it.
And he won't get into it if you ask him if they're taking their boost. By the way, a booster, is that just another vaccine?
Right. Remember what a booster is? It's a vaccine.
There's no such thing.
Such thing as a booster.
You mean the same thing again?
Yeah, the same thing. So when people who they were suspect of me during COVID, when I asked them, they think I was some kind of anti-vaxxer. When I asked them, I go, I just had logical questions about the vax all the way through, and they all turned out to be valid questions because they were lying about the stuff I was asking about. And I said, when did you decide that they were lying to you? Because that's how I like to put it. When did you decide they were lying to you and you stopped taking the boosters? Yeah, well, I don't think that's to say. I mean, did you take the booster? No. Well, they're telling you to. Why didn't you take it? Oh, so now you don't believe them. Or you do believe them, but you think you're smarter?
No, I just don't ask questions, and I'm going to do my thing, and we won't talk about it. And when the priest molests you, it's your fault.
It's your fault.
You're supposed to be watching for his hands, and that's on you.
Back to this.
Oh, absolutely. And that's unfortunately the least of it, because many people who've been injured have had their injuries gaslighted and they haven't been able to get proper medical support, number one. And number two, they haven't been able to get financial support for their loss of income because they can't work. Which I think is even more dreadful, which of course then leads to the mental health issues of being unsure how you're going to pay your mortgage off. I've spoken to a number of people that have not been able to go back to their jobs as a result of their injury. And I've actually had 432 people contact me as a result of a post I put up on Facebook asking for people who were sacked as a result of not taking a second shot after being injured by their first one. And 432 people contacted me.
So people got injured by their first dose. and then they were mandated to take a second dose. The people who got injured didn't want to take the second dose because they already got injured. They got fired for not taking the second dose, even though they got injured by the first dose.
Just risk it.
That's what he just said. This is a senator from Australia. He said 432 people contacted him who got fired for not taking the second dose. That's what he just said, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not just people who've been injured who've been gaslighted and bullied. It's people who don't want a second take a vaccine at all, regardless of their status. And I thought we lived in a free, pluralistic society here where free will meant to be counted for something, but clearly it doesn't.
Yeah, and this is presumably just in your constituency area in Queensland. This is a small segment of Australia.
Well, it's Queensland and Australia. I'm contacted by people across Australia, obviously because I'm in federal parliament, and I'm not going to sort of try and not help people from other states just because I only deal with people in Queensland. But no, so I have been contacted by people across the country. Yeah.
Right, yeah, slightly different systems to the UK. In Western Australia in 2020, there was just over 2 million doses of what we might call traditional pre-COVID vaccines given to the population as a whole. And out of this over 2 million doses of traditional vaccines, there were 270 reports of adverse reactions.
So out of 2 million doses of regular vaccines, there was only 200 and something adverse events, right?
So that's 270 out of over 2 million. 270. Now, there was just under 4,000 COVID vaccines given in 2021. So roughly twice as many COVID vaccines as traditional vaccines of the year before.
Yeah, 4 million.
It was 9.3 million, so just under 4 million. And there was 10,726. So
So it went from 270,000 adverse events to 10,000.
No, 270. Didn't he say that?
270. What did I say?
270,000.
No, that's right. Thank you. No, 270
to 10,000.
To 10,000. That was the jump.
Well, it's still a good enough score to ignore all those people.
To ignore.
If you're on the business end of it.
We would have expected about 550 adverse reactions from the COVID.
So we would have expected 550 adverse events. We got 10,000. Again, this isn't the headline in the newspaper, Kurt. This is not what Rachel Maddow is going to be talking about, or Sean Hannity.
Hey, we thought Iraq was going to go different too, and it went a little
vaccines.
Yeah,
we actually got we got nearly 11,000, which was 97% of the reports following COVID vaccines. What do you think this tells us about the frequency of adverse events following COVID vaccines compared to traditional vaccines?
Well, it tells us that the COVID vaccines are causing a lot more injuries than a traditional vaccine. Step one. And step two, we had about 10 million cases of COVID in Australia by September 2022, 9 months after we opened up the international borders and the state borders, which was almost half the vaccinated population. Now, I've never had mumps, measles, or rubella, like any of the childhood vaccinations you get. Not many people catch that particular disease afterwards, and yet here we are with people who've been given 2 shots at the least, if not boosters, multiple shots, catching COVID on at least once, if not twice. So not only has it got a higher injury rate, it seems to not have worked at all in the first place, which was to stop, the whole point of a preemptive or a prophylactic is to preempt, and prevent the disease. And the whole definition of the vaccine's been changed.
Yeah.
Reuters said.
So now what he just said, I have to correct. Vaccine certainly works. It's fantastic.
I think you need to Reuters this, Jimmy.
Yeah, I got to Reuters this for you.
The definition of vaccines, whatever they tell you it is, and that's how it is.
The vaccine, of course, does work.
And get more of them.
And it'll keep you from getting seriously ill, hospitalized, or death. That's what it never was supposed to stop you from getting it.
Somebody I know right now who got a bunch of
they say.
Got at least 4, has COVID right now, and they don't regret getting 4 shots.
And so what this guy is saying is, I've had all the other vaccines. I never got any of those other diseases. I never got mumps or rubella. I never got measles.
I did have 5 polios.
I never got any of those things. It's not. So he's making the point that is obvious to everybody. And but he's wrong.
Absolutely. So the precise data we've got here is from Western Australia. I mean, are we being unreasonable to extrapolate this into the whole population of Australia, or do you think this is fairly representative of Australia as a whole?
Well, it's all we've got to work with. And Western Australia represents about 10% of the population, so it's a large sample. And it's very significant because Western Australia was the last state to open up its borders to the rest of the world. So 2021 was a clean year. It'll be interesting to see the 2022 data once we include the boosters, because I know a lot of people got the first 2 shots and came out of it okay, but it was the boosters that actually caused the injury. So it would be interesting to see how many injuries are going to be reported in 2022. I have to commend the Western Australian government for actually releasing that report, because many other state governments didn't. The only other data that I am aware of is in regards to cardiac presentations at emergency. and that's been collected by a few different people that have contacted me. So I've got data there for South Australia, Victoria and Queensland. And cardiac presentations for younger people skyrocketed in April, November 2021 in all of those 3 states. Now, 2 of those states, South Australia and Queensland, didn't have COVID at that time, and Victoria had some COVID around that August period, but not later in the year or much less later in the year. So that's also a very strong signal that would indicate that the vaccine was causing heart complications, or myocarditis, pericarditis, to be more specific.
Australia is actually this natural experiment, isn't it? Just waiting for people to start analysing this and getting to some conclusions. Now, this Western Australian report here, it was 6 months late, but I was actually impressed by the candour in the report. It does seem pretty straight talking. Why haven't the other states produced something similar?
That's a good question, John, and I can only speculate again because I'm not, involved with the health departments in those states.
So he's saying, why do we only get this kind of data from Western Australia? Why don't we get it from the rest of the country? And he's going to tell you because they don't want you. They're corrupt. It comes from the top.
But it doesn't suit them to release the data.
Doesn't it?
Is the only reason I can think of. I mean, it is now midway through 2023, and I don't see why it takes up to 18 months. Up to 18 months to release that data.
Yeah. So the total report of adverse events following COVID vaccines was 264 per 100,000 doses for the traditional vaccines in Western Australia, where we have this precise data. So during the same 2021 timeframe, there were 11.1 events per 100,000 doses, whereas with the COVID vaccines, as we've said, it was over 10,000 doses, over 10,000 adverse reactions. Why didn't this come up as a red flag at the time? Why didn't the authorities surely the authorities should have been monitoring this in live time and said, just a minute, there's a problem here. Why didn't that happen?
Because they didn't want to stop the rollout. And I can speak personally to that because I went to see the health minister at the time, Greg Hunt. I advised him of I was contacted by a large number of constituents, in particular young constituents who had serious side effects from the vaccine. And I'm talking paralysis, clots, strokes, tremors.
I've got a long list, Senator. Anaphylaxis, thrombosis with thrombocytopenia, immune thrombocytopenic purpura, Guillain-Barré, myocarditis, pericarditis, myocarditis, chest pain, deep venous thrombosis. We could go on. There was a long list in this report. And again, just alarming to me that didn't come up as a red flag.
Exactly, especially when it was in young, healthy people who had no prior existing conditions and very shortly afterwards then had serious adverse events. Now, maybe they weren't all caused by the vaccine, but there was enough high enough injury rate to be a red flag to the TGA. They should have acted on it, and they did it. The health minister at the time, Greg Hunt, should have, pressed the TGA. He should have picked up the phone to them and said, I've got a senator here who says he's been contacted by a large number of constituents. You said this vaccine was safe and effective. We've got state governments forcing people to take these jabs, or they lose their job. Is it safe, effective, and effective? Yes or no? And can you get to the bottom of why these injuries are occurring? And the head of the TGA at the time, John Skerritt, pretty much gaslighted and dismissed most of the injuries. He kept saying, well, we've got to look at the background rate. So here's the irony. He was saying, well, people get these type of injuries every day. And yes, they probably do. And he kept saying, well, we've got to look at the background rates. Well, we've now got the background rates, or at least from Western Australia, and they would indicate that the COVID vaccine had a much higher injury rate than other vaccines. And the question needs to be asked, as you said, why didn't the TGA monitor this data in real time, and why wasn't it corresponding with the state governments to get this data out quicker and effectively stop the rollout, as far as I'm concerned, at the very least for younger people, younger healthy people of working age population who had very low risk from COVID. I'm not saying there's no risk, but that never happened. And the argument they will put forward is that the risk from the COVID is still worse than the risk from the vaccine. I dispute that, and that's for the reasons we discussed in our prior interview, whereby they did codon optimization, extended the poly-A tail, introduced transfection, et cetera, into the vaccine, which in my view increased the risk of the vaccine greatly, especially since a lot of this stuff hadn't been tested in humans on a longitudinal basis. So, so yet again, the benefit of the doubt for that very reason as well, the fact that testing hadn't been thorough, they should have pulled up stumps the moment they saw such a high injury rate.
Yep. Now, I assume the COVID vaccination program's essentially stopped now in Australia. Is it just high-risk groups that are currently getting vaccinated?
Okay, so that's all you need to know. There's more to it, but so every study now that I can show you almost on a weekly basis, sometimes more, that there's a new study coming out that shows you've been lied to, and lied to on an astronomical level that affects your health directly, of you and your family and people dying, and you've been lied to. And Kurt, I just don't see. So there's no news people who are ever going to get angry about it because their paycheck comes right from the pharmaceuticals. There aren't any politicians who are angry about it, except for RFK Jr. And I don't see anybody, right? Maybe Ron Johnson from Wisconsin.
I used to be angry about it, but then that whole Titanic submarine tour thing happened. I kind of got into that, and
you got distracted a little bit.
Yeah, and then that resolved, and now I got nothing left in my life.
So, so I still a challenge to comedians and news people and politicians. When are you going to get upset about this? They're not.
We should specify the comedians that should be, because a bunch of comedians are my friends. Didn't even I would never expect them to. I'm talking about my friend Big J.
No, I'm talking about the comedians who did jokes shaming people who questioned taking experimental medical treatment,
right? But
that was given to them by the biggest murderous criminals in the world, right. Dr. Fauci and Big Pharma, and they shamed people who had a question, who had legit
it's a specific kind of.
So those are the comedians I'm talking about, and when I see those comedians now, you know what they're talking about? They're talking about dating.
Yeah,
I'm not kidding. That's what they're talking about. They're talking about dating.
I hope they mask up for their dates.
They're literally talking about it right now. We're on the verge of 2 nuclear wars. We just came through COVID, the biggest Russiagate psyop pulled ever. And what are they talking about? Dating.
Well, Jimmy, the whole point of risking your life with a safe, effective vaccine that couldn't possibly hurt you is so that they could get back to their lives, and they have. And can we please just move past it? Think of it like all the civilians murdered in Iraq. Just forget about it. Shut your trap. Oh, my God.
Hey, come see us on tour. We'll be in Baltimore, San Francisco, Huntington Beach, Rosemont, and Chicago, Las Vegas, Salt Lake City, New York City, Pottstown, Pennsylvania, Stamford, Connecticut, and more, and St. Louis. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for all our tickets for all our shows.